So I did research on the spotlight effect, and originally I was trying to find information about the group aspects and what influence they have on the spotlight effect, but I couldn't find a ton of research on that. So what I ended up finding was other aspects that could affect an individual and their likelihood of having the spotlight effect and other social anxieties. So the first study I did was on perspective taking, and it was a neuroimage study, and their hypothesis is that if their subject views an emotional situation in the third person perspective, there will be activation in the right inferior parietal lobe, the frontopolar cortex, and other regions involved in theory of mind tasks. So theory of mind tasks are more complex thinking. It has to do with learning beliefs, ideals, etc. And theory of mind tasks we also use to predict other people's behavior. So they wanted to see how active these would become in taking the role of another person. So they took 10 men, it's a very small sample size, 10 men that are halfway through med school and have good relationships with their mothers. So they took a questionnaire that established whether or not their moms were alive and how close they were, because in order to do this correctly, they wanted to have a base of that relationship, because that would also the activation could depend on the type of relationship that people have. So what they would do is they ask the subjects to take their perspective and their mother's perspective in a neutral and an emotional situation. The neutral situation was simply medical questions, so it's something that they had expertise in, and then they would on the screen it would say according to you or according to your mother, and then they would answer from a list. They had 3 different options for each answer. For example, one was if one of the questions, they could respond with true / without opinion, or false, exact, no idea, inexact. So the answers were on a scale, and that was for both the types of questions, the emotional and the neutral situations. And so then for the emotional situations, they asked questions that would probably elicit a certain type of feeling. So this one is pride. And so an example would be a job promotion is promised to you, and then the series of answers could be impressed / proud / detached, and you could choose. Then they would choose that according to their point of view or their mom's, and then they answered the questions from each point of view. And while they were answering, they were scanned using a PET tomograph, and they took 63 transaxial images that showed the different activation. So right here you can see that the frontopolar gyrus is highly activated in third person neutral and first person emotional, and then it's about equally activated in the first person neutral and the third person. And then also at the right inferior parietal lobe, I think this is the most important of the evidence. It shows a lot of high activation right here in third person emotional and first person neutral, but very low activation in third person neutral, and very low activation as well as in first person emotional. And then this is another area showing the different activations. And so pretty much their hypothesis was correct, and the main reason behind that is that the frontopolar cortex is used in differentiation between the self and others, and so if this area isn't functioning well, human beings would struggle to differentiate what is their life, what is another human being's life, and what is their imagination, and they could all just mush together. So it could be really devastating if someone has damage to that area. And this, in relation to the spotlight effect, is how could taking another person's perspective effect, the spotlight effect, in which you still feel that. And then I thought of the connection between empathy and helping behaviors, and if someone doesn't have their brain isn't structured correctly, or they have developmental problems in these areas, would they struggle to feel empathy, and how would that affect their lives? So that was the first study I did. The second was about countering embarrassment, and this was by, this is by Li Zhang, Amy Drilla, and Carol A. Scott. So they focused on individuals with high public self-consciousness, and their hypothesis is that individuals who struggle with this will take lower, or if they take an observer's perspective, it will lower their personal distress and embarrassment avoidance. And then embarrassment avoidance is pretty much any situation that you will go out of your way to avoid, because you think it could potentially be embarrassing for you because of you don't know enough. There's a whole lot of different reasons that you could be embarrassed by something. So they had 220 undergrad students, 75% of them were female, and the median age was 20. And then they were shown an ad similar to this, and the ad either invoked a actor's role in the situation or an observer's role. And so the actor's role ad said this: "Rip, accidentally passing gas in front of a crush is one of the most embarrassing experiences, guaranteed to linger forever." And then in the experimental group, they did the ad elicited an observer's perspective. Others will know what it's like. Put yourself in their shoes. Would you giggle? Would you be horrified? Would you stare? And so that was trying to push them to think, okay, if I was not the one passing gas in front of all my classmates and I was in that situation, how would I respond to that person? And pretty much the goal of that was to see if they would understand the amount of empathy that they would feel for that individual, and then that would increase the expected empathy for themselves in that situation. And then after they looked at the ad, they were given a list of questions about 2 questions about purchasing intentions, which is pretty much how likely would you be to buy this product, and that levels the measure of embarrassment avoidance. If someone is experiencing high embarrassment avoidance, it's really likely that they would buy this product to avoid that situation. And then the other 2 questions that they asked were about the level of expected empathy from others in that situation. And so the results confirmed their hypothesis that individuals with high public self-consciousness experience less distress and lower purchasing intentions for products involved in embarrassment avoidance. So when they answered these questions, the individuals that were shown the observer's perspective ad were way less likely to buy the product, and they didn't feel the need for it as much. And then they also expected higher levels of empathy, which I think is often big when you actually think about someone else in that situation. How you would respond is always a good way to avoid embarrassment. It is actually, it was effective. And I think a big thing in the connection with the spotlight effect is how much of the individual that is struggling with the spotlight effect, how much are they putting themselves in other people's shoes, how well do they experience empathy. And also I think it's hard to say, but to test a level of selfishness or egocentrism, and I think that's a big cause of these things, is people are very self-absorbed, and so they think everyone is looking at them in whatever embarrassing situation, even though everyone has so many other things to think about. So I think it would be a really interesting study to talk about, to look into levels of egocentrism, narcissism, and embarrassment avoidance spotlight effect and levels of empathy, and seeing how well these people can actually feel for other people, and if that will change their level of social anxiety as well. And then the last study I did was, it was a European study, and they focused on social norms and individuals with high social anxiety or social anxiety disorder, or SAD. And so their hypothesis was that individuals with high social anxiety will experience greater feelings of embarrassment or inappropriateness to intentional and unintentional social norm violations. So what they did is they gathered participants ages 13 to 33, and there's 87, which again, it's a pretty small sample group. But they did the age range so that because a lot of social anxiety develops in adolescence, so they wanted to see at what point that starts developing, and then if these teenagers and young adults, how prominent that was. And so every participant was given 3 different stories. The first story, there was no social norm violated. The second story was an unintentional social norm violation. And then the third story was an intentional social norm violation. And then the stories also, they were given different stories based on their gender and their age, because in each age group and gender, there's different social norms that would be more uncomfortable to violate. And so then they would rate these stories on 2 different scales. So one was level of inappropriateness. So 1, not inappropriate at all, to 5, which is highly inappropriate. And then the other scale was embarrassment, and 1 was not embarrassing at all to extremely embarrassing at 5. So participants would answer those, and then they also completed an assessment that measured their level of anxiety when asked to place themselves in the story. And there isn't a good test for adults and adolescents, so they had to take the Z-score of that. And then the results of this showed that individuals who already had high social anxiety or SAD showed greater social anxiety from the accidental violation of a social norm than from the intentional violation of a social norm. And that half agrees with their hypothesis, or half proves it. And I have a couple funny images of social norms. But I think that was a really big revelation. At least I thought it was really important in showing really the root of these things. And so with the unintentional social norm violation, it shows, I think, a lack of social competency, and that's why individuals were more embarrassed and felt that it was more inappropriate, because they didn't even know. They didn't know that what they were doing was wrong, and we as people don't want to feel stupid. We don't want others to think of us in that way. So it's also trying to maintain our public image in that sense. And it's funny too, when you're in a public situation and you see someone that was raised outside of your culture. Like my cousins grew up in Cambodia. They violated so many American social norms when they came back. It was terrible. So hard to be in public with them. But when you see individuals who are raised in a different culture come to a different social norm and they violate that social norm, it doesn't seem as inappropriate or as embarrassing, because they don't know, they weren't brought up in it. Whereas if I violated some of the norms that they were, it would be like, whoa, what's wrong with this girl? What's she doing? And so I think a lot of it has to do with maintaining our self-image and our self-concept, and we never want to be no one likes to be the weird one or the odd one out. That's just not how we were created. And I think there's a lot of different ways to deal with social anxiety and these embarrassment avoidance situations, because taking the observer's perspective will definitely, I think, overall help in some way, and understanding, you aren't the center of these people's worlds, and no one really cares what you're doing. And obviously it depends on the situation, but people are really, really busy. It's not, you're not the center. So I think that's one thing, is removing oneself from the center, lowering egocentrism. And then again, taking the observer's perspective, thinking about how would I treat someone that was in this situation. That's always a big way to limit social anxiety. And if you're feeling embarrassed, like thinking about the level of empathy you would have for another individual. But for me, the biggest way is I think really all of our fears are rooted in not being accepted and loved. And I think we've learned that a lot this semester. And the biggest comfort is always knowing that there is a God that fully knows me and fully loves me. And people might not accept you when you violate a social norm or do something embarrassing or hurt someone, but God always does, and he has already forgiven you. And I mean, he knows us to our deepest, worst desires and worst thoughts. And he still loves us so much more than we can even comprehend. And for me, that's been really comforting when I experience anxiety or am overthinking about something that I did. So yeah, that's all I've got right now. So these are my references and Matt's. Mine are Boss Hugendam, Jiang L, and Ruby P. So those are my 3. Thank you so much for listening. Definitely hope quarantine is going well. And just remember, you are fully known and fully loved.